Over the years, video gaming's mimicry of basketball has gradually become more and more a part of the culture. Today, it's a billion-dollar empire and a part of the daily conversation, but we traveled a long way to get to this point. This journey began in 1973 when Magnavox released a game called Basketball. Many sleepless nights over that title, which was basically a repurposed version of Pong where two mangled pixel clusters play one-on-one full court by throwing an overcharged ball of light into what looks like, some kind of postmodern furniture. From there, we got the first NBA licensed game in 1979 for the Intellivision. Then we got the infamously flawed Double Dribble in 86 and Arch Rivals in 89. In the early 90s, there were multiple memorable offerings from a scrappy upstart company called Electronic Arts. 5-on-5 simulations that were more or less the same game with different rosters. A radical change came in 1993 when Midway released an arcade cabinet that would rock the landscape by appealing to both hardcore hoop fans and what we call the casuals. It was called NBA Jam. By the mid-90s, EA had already dabbled successfully in the basketball space a number of times, but in 1995 they turned their attention to the hardwood by kicking off a series that would dominate the industry for the next several years, a series called NBA Live. The NBA Live franchise took basketball simulation to another level and entertained players for a number of years, but its success also set the table in 2001 for a looser, more exaggerated version of the sport called NBA Street. Imagine a game with all the charm and the compelling action of the NBA, but instead yanked out of the comfort of big arenas that billionaires refuse to pay for and thrust into a less organized setting on the playground. The 4 entries from this franchise hit the mark every single time, but nearly 20 years later, one installment of NBA Street towers above the rest. This is a story about things coming together. It's a story about how a team of unlikely collaborators joined forces to create one of basketball's most precious cultural artifacts and one of the greatest sports video games of all time. This, my good people, is the story of NBA Street, Volume 2. The inaugural iteration of NBA Street was a hit. It had clearly hit on something that the public wanted, and from there, it opened a door to greater possibilities.
It felt like a dry run at what this was trying to be, but it almost like a half measure. It didn't fully embrace the sort of really bombastic nature of what the vision for this series could have been. And which is funny, in the same way that a lot of video games, like throughout history, the first ones almost set up a template for what can come afterwards.
This is Bruce McMillan. He was the driving force behind the creation of a scrappy franchise called FIFA, and he was the vice president of studios for EA Canada in 2003, which he also co-founded.
I think EA knew it had a hit on its hand, with Volume 1 with Street, and it gave the team authority to take the title to the next level as it saw fit. When I saw Street, I think I'm a pretty good gamer. I looked at this and I went, this is something that's remarkable and it's different and it should get nurtured.
Because the first game worked, there was motivation to ramp up the immersive quality and the detail of the game in the next go-around. Authenticity was a high priority.
I mean, we were dudes from Canada mostly trying to build a street basketball game. Like, what do we know about the culture? So we had to get into it, and we really tried.
If there's no basketball culture in a particular city, like, it's hard to have that nerdy heritage.
We were trying to make something authentic, but we were never going to be authentic. If you can get somebody who really knows it and walks it and feels it, then you have to be open to that.
And wherever we kind of lacked on the actual development team, because yes, we were smart, we were talented, we weren't always the cultural phenoms, we'd bring people in.
What they needed was a liaison to all things hoop, on and off the court. If you're a basketball fan who grew up in the 90s or early 2000s, Jimmy Smith is a guy who has had a significant impact on your cultural experience, whether you realize it or not. Through his work with Wyden Kennedy and Nike, very few people, if any, were more in rhythm with the beating heart of basketball than him, specifically when it came to respecting the street game. We're talking about campaigns like City Attack. We're talking about Dr. Funk, in which Vince Carter played a fictional Rucker Park legend. And, maybe most importantly, remember that Nike Freestyle commercial? That came from Jimmy's brain.
And Will Moselle called.
He's talking about this guy, the lead producer on NBA Street Volume 2 and an important player in the game's success. He also worked as a producer on a ton of other EA Sports titles.
And he goes, yeah, Jimmy, I'd like to talk to you about this video game project that we're working on. We want you to work on it with us. So I'm thinking I'm going to be a hero bringing in EA Sports game advertising to White and Kennedy. He goes, no, we want you to take what you did in Soul of the Game, what you did in Freestyle, what you did in Dr. Funk, and all of that stuff, City Attack, and infuse it into this game. Help us co-create it, create the characters, storylines, and all the things you do with a video game.
Again, if you imagine basketball as a house, Jimmy would be considered one of the best interior designers in the world. He innately understands the decor.
He was a great sort of gut check. We were all trying to become students of this, but he was engrossed in that lifestyle. Obviously, Nike at the time, if anybody had mastered selling to that group, it was this space.
He was out there mainstream, killing it, crushing it with the people we wanted to sell this game to.
So let's go back to the Dr. Funk ad for just a moment because we breeze past some relevant details. First of all, this sequence was inspired by a legendary early Hoops internet moment that happened on hoopstv.com, RIP, when Vince Carter did a windmill off of a lob during a rained-out Rucker game. You kids probably don't remember that. Second, the choreography here is eerily similar to the gameplay of NBA Street Volume 2. Lastly, stop the tape. That guy right there barking into the mic, that voice. The West Side Coast timeout! Sounds familiar, right? He's a big character in this story.
We would do what we could, but the greatest thing about it was getting someone like Bobbito.
My name is Bobbito Garcia, aka DJ Cucumber Slice.
For a Hoops game that was trying to nail an authentic vibe, that is the intersection of hip-hop, fashion, and first-hand perspective on the street game, adding Bobbito Garcia to the mix was the equivalent of doing a windmill dunk off of a behind-the-back alley-oop.
Bobbito is kind of a basketball renaissance guy because he touches and adds value to basketball culture from so many different angles.
Cool Bob Love was a co-host throughout the 90s on Stretch and Bobbito, one of the most influential hip-hop shows of all time. He's written books about the history of sneaker culture. He's a DJ. He's produced films about street and playground basketball in New York City, and he has a wealth of first-hand hooping experience on the playground. Bringing Jimmy Smith into the fold opened the connection to Garcia because the two had known each other from collaborations of the past.
Damn, he just changed the game. Right. He took the game to another level.
When they brought on Jimmy Smith to EA, it was because of his work at Nike, and naturally Jimmy was like, if you want authentic, I got the guy for you.
Yeah, I'm going, hey, we need a maestro. We need like the Duke, like Duke used to do the games at Rucker.
So we said there's a thing out there. There are announcers out there that are not your traditional announcers. They're more the show, bringing entertainment to the masses there in the arena.
And it's like, we need that type of dude. That dude is Bobbito. Bobbito will kill that.
The remarkable thing about Cool Bob Love was the way that he seemed to pulsate like a passionate, animated, and colorful advocate for the history of the game. He was squarely in the moment, and he brought a very appropriate dose of unpredictability.
When DJ Cucumber Slice came into the scene, the energy level went from probably 0 to 1,000.
And he came in and he was just like something else. Like he was just burning white hot.
He just brought so much energy, so much passion, so much knowledge that you were just drinking it through a fire hose. It was just like, whoa.
It's like people would ask him a question in the future and he'd have half an hour to think about the craziest answer, except that wasn't what was happening. And you'd ask him a question and he'd give you this craziest answer. And it's like, when are you gonna have the time to think about that? Like, the guy was so fast.
When I say Bobbito Garcia's performance as the commentator for NBA Street Volume 2 is utterly iconic and seemingly grafted onto the popular modern basketball vernacular, I still feel like I'm selling him short.
This has to be probably maybe the best commentary in sports history. I mean, growing up in Wisconsin, I remember being like, are these real? Like, is he messing with us? Like, is this like pizza without the crust? Do people say this?
For a lot of sports games to that point, which inherently ate up huge chunks of time, the repetition of commentary would become ridiculously fatiguing. To fully capitalize on what Bobbito could do, they had to trust and encourage him to let it fly.
Typically, we would write a script and say, okay, we need to talk about this, we need to talk about that, and here's the bucket, here's the game situation that's happening. Well, with Bobbito, take that plan and throw it out.
the script writers for EA Sports were all hockey players. None of them played ball. I told them from jump, like, yeah, I'll read the script for you, but you have to let me ad lib. You have to let me improv. And they were like, yes, no, we need that. We really need you to do that. So I got into my groove, and then I was just like, yo, like, why don't you let me just write script?
I think that they knew they were going to want him to do a lot of his own shtick.
There were guidelines, but then we set him loose.
It had to be compelling enough to where you'll be locked into this game for hours on end.
After you've heard dunk, for the 50th time, like, we want to try to have the game provide a new way to say dunk. Well, you could say flush, you could say boof, you could say yaka, you could say yoke, and then they were like, okay, yeah, keep on going. That's a pizza crust without the slice. Or, I would just start saying crazy things, and they were like totally encouraging me in the studio. Like, yeah, just keep on going. Like, that's a milkshake without any milk.
Sometimes he'd start talking about food, and I'm like, okay, cool. We take a break. I'd pause. I say, hey, what's up with all the food references? Man, I'm hungry.
Yo, B, you bugging out, man. You trying to eat a burrito with no fork? Pounded like red ground beef on a hot summer day at the barbecue. That's right, stick a fork in a meatball.
But I'd have to turn around and not face him because I didn't want him to see me, losing it in the booth.
Bobbito's work was absolutely peerless among the games that had been released to that point, and there are many that believe that it's unrivaled to this day. Street 2's end-to-end attention to detail is a big part of what made it special. For things to hit a certain level, every moment had to be accounted for. When you get in the car or you step foot in your apartment and you insist that nothing else happens until the perfect song is playing? Maybe it's just me. That's what the start of this game was like. You knew that careful measures are being taken to protect this vibe. Two people are responsible for this. The first is Kirk Gibbons, the art director for the game. Remember that ridiculously awesome commercial for the Air Jordan 12 where MJ was spinning in slow motion while all these fans were frozen in awe of him? Kirk helped create that, and his own aesthetic fit this project perfectly.
He was very California, old school art style, kind of jazzy, old school vibe.
So that was kind of our core, was like street art along with kind of mixing in 70s kind of vibe, and then like a little bit of jazz records. So street art, jazz, 70s, and that mixes up, in that way.
The other is Adam Myhill, the technical art lead. He's worked on all sorts of digital cinematography innovation and tech. His genius is taking artistic vision and creating a technical approach that might bring it into reality.
Kirk and I would think about, like, from the very start, like from when you put the disc in, right from when you close the lid, what was that experience?
I was really passionate, and Adam was really passionate about, let's actually make an experience the minute you put in the disc, right?
We wanted to craft that whole thing, like I put the legal screens in the billboard that's in the world. We had that 3D camera that went through the whole city. And
at the time, no one had really done something like that. And we had to kind of fight for it internally, even at the time, because people didn't, and people were always like, people don't care. People just want to play. Like, that was kind of the video game rationale at the time, right? But I'm coming from branding. I'm like, no, the minute you put it, it's our first chance to talk to our players and our consumers.
We looked at Blue Note records as an inspiration, and Kirk came up with the idea for the Blue Note records. And I wrote this little shader that rendered the whole scene, but it did it in 2 shades of blue and 1 shade of black. I think it was 4 or 5 colors. And it was this, like, we tried to make it look like a Blue Note record, but in 3D.
Each element of color leading up to the actual in-game experience was intentionally paced.
So because I like, pacing, in terms of like, let's keep it cool in the beginning. And then again, when you come into the game, there's more energy coming.
Volume 2's in-game aesthetic, that is the players themselves and how they move within their environment, was unlike anything that had come before it. In the past, sports games had been stages where the big swings were made at accurately and realistically depicting human beings in motion. Flexing the best technology available was a way to lure customers into buying the game year after year. But Street 2 is aiming at something else.
Street 2 wasn't going for photorealism at all. Unlike, say, if you would go back to like an NBA Live game from that era, you'd be like, well, that's, those faces look weird and that just, looks kind of strange. Whereas this game feels like a strange interpretation of basketball. Like, it's not quite basketball. It's like a kid telling you a story about a basketball game he saw the night before.
So Kirk was art director, but very much like not a technical, not a game builder. Kirk was like illustrator, like vision guy. Adam is hardcore technical guy. Like, I'm gonna make your stuff look amazing.
So he kind of helped me craft that look because I'm not technical. So my part in that was like, man, you know, I come from street culture. Like, how cool would it be if we can make graffiti come to life and have them be the players, you know? And he's like, okay, well, let's figure out how we can do that, right?
The conception was, as I remember it, was basically murals. Like, picture by the street ball court, right? There's this beautiful mural of your heroes, and they've just come off the wall and they're going to come play basketball.
The lighting, the textures, everything that was in there, it wanted to be a warm vibe. It's happy. The characters and our players wanted to pop off that background, almost like it was a canvas, right?
But the courts being a real place, we tried to light them as realistic as possible. But the characters we wanted to stylize. The characters were a little more imagined, but they were on a more photorealistic environment.
The city itself can be a gallery for self-expression, and for a hooper, to be immortalized as a mural is one of the highest honors that you can achieve. To bring this into the game, MyHill spearheaded a rendering technique that took on a catchy name.
The characters have a rendering system. It's completely new. We're calling it street shading.
Adam built this shader where everything almost looked like running ink, and it was gorgeous. Every artist in the building came up to look at this thing.
So you get into this weird space where if you try to make somebody look photoreal, but they do these like outlandish animations, you just get this uncanny valley. Like, it just doesn't quite click. So we wanted to stylize everything. So not just the motion, but we wanted to stylize like the lighting and the you know, graphical representation of the characters.
Street shading was especially effective in the way that it depicted the NBA's old school legends who, in this game, were suddenly stepping into a kind of field of dreams scenario where they were suddenly the young, prime versions of themselves. Generational arguments fuel the conversation around the game, so what better place to answer questions than here? Could Dr. J posterize Yao Ming? Could Allen Iverson cross up Magic Johnson? Could Shaq put Wilt on his back? Maybe, possibly. But lionized versions of the players, each one rocking their game uniform in the park, felt fondly remembered through this approach.
NBA Street does such a good job of taking NBA players and making them heroes. And they are kind of superheroes in our world. And so, like, I think, and again, this wasn't the intent, but I think like doing them in that art style kind of, you know, made them larger than life and fun. You know, they also had longer limbs, which helped enhance the animation, right? So you're like seeing more of the gestures and stuff.
In a promo for this game, Will Moselle described the experience of playing it as
easy to pick up, difficult to master.
EA Big was a subsidiary of EA Sports at the time. Seriously, pour a big one out for EA Big. And with titles like SSX and SSX Tricky, NFL Street, and FIFA Street, that studio's brand was about pushing these sports into extreme directions and challenging the boundaries. Street 2's gameplay set the bar for what that could look like.
It's a basketball game, but it's also kind of a puzzle game and also kind of a fighting game.
What the fuck is he talking about?
Like, in the same way that Tony Hawk it's a skateboarding game, but it's not really a skateboarding game.
Games in the past had been very much about the idea of going from A to B. Avoid getting hit by the boss or by the obstacles. What games like Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, and later the Tony Hawk series did was usher in an era of style points. Winning is still the objective, but now there's a deeper world of mastery available to players who wanted more, and that kept people coming back again and again.
You know, when you play regular basketball games, kind of all in your mind is like, how do I score right now? Am I going to shoot a three, or am I going to try to like post up, down low? Whereas when you're playing this, it's less about how do I get the one or the two and more about the entire journey to get there.
So in Street, it wasn't not only I'm going to beat you, but I'm going to beat you with a bunch of style and a bunch of presumption. You're going to remember how you got beat. The team really looked at what makes basketball exciting. What is the most exciting part of basketball? And let's amp that up 10 times, 20 times, 50 times.
These are the core elements of basketball fun. A meal where every course is dessert. Of course, many fates were decided when a player got on such a roll that they triggered an opportunity for a game breaker.
Those game breakers felt like Mario Kart in a way to where even if you were really far behind, you could unlock one of those and completely reverse the course of the game. You know, in the same way in like Mario Kart, you can get a blue shell or a star. You can go from 7th to 2nd.
This journey to get from gaining possession of the ball to putting the ball in the basket gave the player a sense of freedom that had not been present in any previous basketball game. It was almost like having a mic in your hand as a beat played behind you. You got 4 bars to express yourself. This was a core overlap on the Venn diagram of basketball and hip hop, and to have a video game accurately capture this It thrilled people because in the rawness of the moment, the frauds are separated from the gods.
In the realm of off the top of the head freestyling, where you're in the moment and you are looking at someone in the crowd and then talking about them and incorporating that experience in your verse, is very similar to playing pickup basketball, where there's no plays, there's no coaches. Right? That's the beauty of pickup.
That variety of experience also applied to game modes. You could pick the game up for 15 minutes and battle somebody head-to-head, or you could set off on a kind of Hoops Heroes journey. Something of a basketball RPG that seems like a definite precursor to the My Player mode from 2K that we see everywhere now. Be a Legend put the player in the position to create their player and start from square one in the street ball community. At square one, you're a nobody. From there, a squad is assembled and branded, and then the road towards hero status begins. The map in front of the player was a series of cities with rich playground traditions. Rucker is the alpha omega setting for street hoops, of course, the incomparable soul in the hole, Foster Beach, Mosswood.
And what made me fall in love with it was Mosswood Park was in the game. It wasn't like the Bay Area is what it is now, right? It wasn't one of those things where we were known in video games and on a national scale like that, at least not in my mind. I wasn't thinking, and I said like, oh, this is Mosswood Park that's in there, and it's in North Oakland. This is maybe a 10-minute drive from where I'm from. And I remember like being like, oh wow, I really like this game. Like I loved it, but I really like it now because it has a piece of home in it.
With each win and with each electrifying performance, your player's rep grows and spreads across the map.
You know, after you won a game, you'd be on the cover of a magazine during a loading screen. That was so cool to me that like my street character would be, oh, he's coming to LA to play, or no, he's coming here.
This forces your path to cross with some fictional street ball bosses who offer unique challenges. Stretch is a carryover from Volume 1 and a Dr. J facsimile. Biggie Little is low to the ground and low down and dirty as a ball handler. Dime is a passing whiz, and a breakthrough as a female boss in a video game.
Those were kind of primitive girl in video game times. It's a very embarrassing era for games. So I remember us talking about the girl's appearance a lot, noodling things which were ridiculous, and most of the people on the street team just weren't having it. Like we saw that was, objectifying and stupid.
I think this was my biggest war at all of EA. I kept sending them pictures of WNBA stars, and they kept sending me strippers back. Pants way down, thong hanging out, breasts bigger than her head. I'm like, okay, let's try this again.
For all of the masterfully curated elements of this game, at the end of the day, it's also just fun as hell to play. And that remains true all these years later. With the vibe checklist nearly complete, one crucial aspect of this world still needed to be perfectly executed: the music. This was a twofold proposition, the first of which was dialing in the background beats and syncing the original music to the in-game action. To pull that off, they need the touch of a modern master, and that's exactly what they got in Justin Smith, known to the music world as Just Blaze.
EA was looking for a bit of legitimacy musically. It was kind of a thing where it was like, get in with us on Street Volume 2 so that we can really kick 2K's ass when it comes time to make NBA Live 2003.
To land a producer like Blaze, who'd go on to contribute to other EA titles, was colossal. By 2003, he'd already produced artists like Busta Rhymes, Jay-Z, Big Pun, and Mariah Carey, and in the future he'd work on classics like Kanye's Late Registration and Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City. That resume spoke loudly enough on its own, but seeing him work firsthand deepened the belief of some of the team members.
When Just Blaze came up and we signed a deal, hey, we're going to do some music together, he was like, why don't we do music right now?
Electronic Arts at the Burnaby office where we made the game has this world-class recording studio.
It was like, we don't have the equipment. Okay, I just did some research. There's my mixer is in Seattle. Somebody went and got it, right? He stuck around for the weekend, started mixing stuff right in the studio.
And I'd never seen anything like it. Just Blaze went in there and he hooked up, can't remember the exact one, but it's like a sampler with all the touch pads on it. And he walked into the studio like he'd been in there 100 times and then plugged this thing in. And in like 10 minutes, he was throwing down the craziest beats. He's just doing them on the fly. And, oh, you want this? And I realized like, wow, man, like that is a talent, When we think of these producers that do hip hop or any music and you're like, yeah, well, they're producers. I could do that. No, man, you could not do that. This guy was like something else.
In their words, they had never seen anything like that before. Somebody just coming up with music right there on the spot. Like, oh, this feels like a moment where this should play. And then me doing it. Every once in a while, those stories stories come back to me where they were like, dude, you were just, sitting there on the studio floor. And I'm like, I'm just doing what I do.
Much like Bobbito, Blaze's ability to work fluidly and sync his work to what the team had put together was key in creating that organic experience. The second crucial musical aspect of this game was the soundtrack. This is an area where the game really pops off the pages of video game history. The curation of tracks reflected the game itself. On one hand, it was new school, hip-hop centric and groovy with songs from Nelly, Nate Dogg, and Dilated Peoples with Talib Kweli. And on the other hand, the game really transcended with its strong dose of credible classic old school. Chief Rocka by Lords of the Underground, The Choice Is Yours by Black Sheep, and the track that would ultimately become synonymous with the title and arguably the entire franchise itself, They Reminisce Over You by Pete Rock and CL Smooth. These picks fit the vibe of the game perfectly because they were mostly hip-hop staples that sampled jazz phrases in the same way that the art direction and the spirit of the game did.
It was just the perfect storm to kind of connect the dots on different eras of what was happening for us culturally. That was definitely one of the things that came up in that very first meeting, was like, how ill would it be to have like a 12-year-old kid even knowing about They Reminisce Over You. We were just trying to figure out how to connect as many dots as possible.
The soundtrack is out of this world. This is like as good as like a Grand Theft Auto soundtrack in terms of finding specific songs that really help create the tone and the vibe that the developers were going for.
So you fast forward years later, and now we have, things like YouTube and whatnot. I'm looking at, things like the Wurlitzer beat or the Z beat or the Young Guru beat or whatever, having hundreds of thousands of hits on YouTube, and I'm like, what? And then I'm reading the comments of the people, and so many people are like, oh man, I just play this game just to listen to the music, or I put this game on just to listen to the music. The fact that like people went through the trouble of ripping the music off the games to even post it online was a big deal for me.
Although NBA Street Volume 2 stands on its own as a timeless game, its impact was intensified by the time of its release, and if you zoom out, it signified that the identity of the league was undergoing a healthy change. If you consider the activism that we see in the league today and the embrace of the outspoken individual with a platform, that span of time, from the early 90s up through the start of the new millennium, was crucial for the evolution of the NBA. Much of that was accelerated by the chemical reaction taking place between hip-hop and basketball cultures, which had been stewing for a long time.
Obviously, music and basketball go together.
So I was on the basketball courts a lot, which again was unusual, but that's really where hip-hop was mostly practiced. It wasn't a party itself, a full-out block party.
Both come from the same place. I mean, in the 70s, a lot of the earliest park jams were held at basketball courts. The jams were at Dykeman, were at Rucker, were at the GOAT, the very courts that are like celebrated years later for basketball. And so there's long been a synergy between those two.
First of all, for this or that reason, retro style, specifically stuff from the late 70s and early 80s, was in. Mitchell and Ness was just starting to take off, and 2003 was the first time a retro design was ever used as the official jersey for the NBA All-Star Game. It was everywhere.
Everything about the game just felt very now at the time, but what was happening in the now was old school.
These things were highly visible and propelled by the fashion choices that were happening in rap. And in the years leading up to this, rap's influence had really become a factor for the overall culture of basketball. It's hard to imagine this today, but back then, that shift of influence was a big deal.
In the early days of hip hop, 70s and 80s, basketball players were inspiring the rappers more so than the rappers were inspiring basketball players. The music wasn't really influencing the sport that much. So if you think about it, in the breakthrough song, Rapper's Delight, I got a color TV so I can see the Knicks play basketball.
I got a color TV so I can see the Knicks play basketball.
Because this street-driven genre and art form was blooming for the first time, largely emanating from the black culture, it was on a journey towards mainstream legitimacy, and that would take some time.
The complexity of black culture is overlooked. You really don't have a sense of
how complex the relationships are in what happens in the music. Because people say, oh, this is some new cute thing. Every black music has been a fad.
Hip-hop was a more direct and honest depiction of urban and oftentimes African-American life than any art form that had come before it. And as a league that was predominantly black, this divide was on an unavoidable collision course with the way that the league's workforce presented itself. The conversations about race and culture and the friction that came with marketing the league to a predominantly white audience with those things in mind, this was familiar territory for the NBA.
This is a league that was basically discounted 20 years ago. It was too black, the salaries were too high at $260,000.
Race is always an issue, and that's just the way it is. And the NBA has always been on the edge of discussions of race.
I mean, I sat in the editorial offices of the Boston Globe where one of the editors of one of the sections said, "You don't understand, Stern," and this is before I was commissioner actually, "your sport will never succeed because a white America is never going to accept a black sport, and you're becoming a black sport."
So in the 90s, hip hop was not yet mainstream, and it was still scary, and you'd had a league that had spent decades at that point trying to become more palatable to the broader, wider audience. Hip hop represented something that was more threatening still, that was unknown, that was unaccepted by mainstream America.
Scary, threatening. The use of those two words is extremely telling, but there were many who felt that hip-hop's prominence changed very little. The music was mirroring realities in America, not creating them or provoking them. With a predominantly white audience, the NBA was extremely hesitant to use their brand as an exposure to this tension.
To me, the telltale thing was they had the ad campaign, Love It Live, and they're using Elvis and Frank Sinatra. You're using dead white singers to try to encourage people to come watch young black people play live.
I'm all shook up.
And the disconnect there, this very much was an attempt by the league to go after, middle-aged white people and try to get them to buy season tickets and suites and things like that.
Just to clarify, not all hip-hop was facing this level of opposition. Dudes in tracksuits wearing medallions and spouting social consciousness through simple rhyme schemes were definitely charting a new course in popular music, but it wasn't as controversial as what would come next. By the mid to late 80s, artists like Schoolie D and Ice-T had begun to pioneer a subgenre of hip-hop that took a more visceral approach and set out to give a raw reflection of what urban life was really like. Some called it reality rap, but the name that stuck, gangster rap, was far less marketable to the general public at the time.
White mainstream society, if they don't understand us as a people, damn sure they're not going to understand our music and our arts and what comes out of the people.
Still, the opposition brought attention, and that attention brought dollars. This influenced and shifted the way that record labels did business at the time.
There was too much consciousness going on in hip-hop at that time for the powers that be. So here comes gangster rap. Take off the medallions, you know what I mean? Stop all that peace and unity and let's do some hoes and cocaine and gang banging.
Did that bother you?
Yes, it did.
Really?
Yes, it did.
What I will say is that a lot of these companies at the highest level are gangsters themselves. And if you want to get rid of gangster rap, first you got to get rid of the gangster record company.
I personally think it is dangerous because, not so much because it makes people go out and do things that are dangerous, but because it kind of makes it seem like it's natural and it's acceptable. And since people like Schoolie D are really cool and he says these things, then those things become cool. And they're not cool.
Rap then began to degenerate. It was no longer social commentary. It became pure vulgarity. It was no longer social commentary. It became pornography.
In the NBA, the resistance to this movement played out even among its own players. A passing of the torch happened in the mid-90s. The storybook era of MJ and a more straight-laced, buttoned-down NBA was coming to a close, and as his contemporaries were aging out of the league, a new generation, raised on a culture that was fed by this new art form, was set to take center stage. There was a vibe of resentment in the air.
Your era doesn't know shit.
and generally a feeling that these undisciplined punks were
prima donnas.
The NBA was uncomfortable with this notion that its players were representing this culture, that were, raised in this culture now as you get to the 90s, because the thing was, how can we package this and sell this to the broadest possible audience?
No player embodied the full, unapologetic confidence and bravado of this movement more acutely than Allen Iverson. And as a result, no one drew more scrutiny. Had Iverson been some unknown dude trying to break into the league, things might have been different, but AI was a star. He was an electrifying athlete who'd been the #1 pick in the 1996 NBA draft, and he utilized a scoring bag that keyed on cooking people in one-on-one situations. That kind of thrilling approach aligned perfectly with the brand of the street game. With hip-hop culture surging in to grip the mainstream for the first time, street basketball now bubbling up as an edgier subculture, and fashion taking its cues from both of those phenomena, something undeniably was in the air. And for the NBA to delay participating in it, well, it was odd.
David Stern fought against that, man.
Yeah.
Very clearly, I remember David Stern fighting against that even when it came down to hip-hop songs in the arenas. I may shut him down specifically for a team like the Knicks ready to play defense. And the NBA was like, that's that hip-hop shit, man. We're trying to stay far away from that.
Because on the streets, hip-hop culture and basketball culture was already going strong, but NBA kind of like culture, mixing that with the NBA culture, you had a lot of pushback.
That pushback happened on a number of fronts, but there were some notable examples. Iverson's controversial rap album, which actually has some decent tracks on it, was suppressed by the league. The NBA famously airbrushed Iverson's tattoos from the cover of their official magazine, and apparently did the same in some of their licensed EA games at the time.
I actually did take out Iverson's tattoos on one of the NBA games. Like, I was the dude that painted it out. These were all debates, maybe isn't the right word, but these were all discussions. But at one point, we had to back Iverson's tattoos off because I remember painting them out of his arms.
The year of 2003 and the release of this game did not signify that the league and its audience had fully reconciled with the culture and all of the subsequent issues that required examining. The malice at the palace was still to come in 2004 and the infamous dress code in 2005, but the NBA Street franchise was an improvement from their previous stance of filtering out urban culture at every turn and avoiding it like the plague. The continued popularity of the movement allowed the league to take a step back and see that it was a feasible way for them to fuse these things to their commercial identity going forward. And like it or not, that eased some of the trepidation.
They totally embraced it, and things started opening up around that time. I think what it was, they saw the money in it. But the more freedom you give the players, the more exciting the game is. The more exciting the game is, the more viewers you're going to get, and so on and so forth, right? The more jerseys you're going to sell.
I think the NBA saw it as that's where the culture's going. That's what's happening. So the NBA was seeing the value of this. I think they were seeing the true value of working with EA at the time.
The NBA was so far ahead on so many things, but I would say they lagged on the embrace of hip hop. And that's what allowed the street ball ethos to rise as fast as it did, because they were quicker to embrace hip hop. And it was everywhere. The look, the sound, the style of it, it was throughout street ball. So you had this growing popular wave that loved these things.
You know it well and others understand it, but the glimpse back needs to be, you have to include hip hop. You have to include the music that is just bowling people over. It's changing trajectories of how people think.
That popular wave was swelling up all over the place, but most notable was when the N1 mixtapes hit the basketball world with all the force of a great typhoon. As a company and as a voice within the culture, N1 was the little guy on the block, but their influence started to pick up momentum as their gear began popping up in the pickup setting. And if you ask our guy Jimmy Smith, N1 took the early street work that Nike had done and used it as a jumping off point.
They literally stole the City Attack campaign, because there was a time when Nike stopped City Attack, and they said, hey, just this void here, we should jump in on that street thing, and that's what they did.
By the time NBA Street Volume 2 came out, N1 had released the 6th iteration of their mixtape video, and trick-minded self-expression and individualism had fully saturated the basketball world. It seemed inevitable that their reach would extend to the making of this game, and that manifested in the idea of touring. the idea of growing a rep, and even showed up in the movements of the players themselves.
The N1 guys that formed most of our mocap talent, Shane the Dribbling Machine, a pharmacist, just to name two, they'd come in and we'd have these conversations about their stories. And that would heavily influence what NBA Street Volume 2 became.
April 29th, 2003, NBA Street Volume 2 finally made its debut. From there, it soared to one of the highest and most enthusiastic critical responses for any basketball game ever released. Most of the reviews were positive and, tasteful.
What'd you think of this one?
Yo, boy, what up, cucumber slice? This action be off the hook, homie.
Cringe, cringe, cringe.
I want to die.
Also, quick sidebar, this game produced some sought-after pieces of gear in the form of ultra-rare sneakers and Mitchell Ness jerseys. I just wanted to make sure that I got that in. This game is a love letter. It's a passionate, head-over-heels ode to basketball culture, and because they nailed the tone and the fun factor of playing the game landed so incredibly in the center of the bullseye, this game's footprint all these years later is huge.
I don't think, bands, when they're making a solid gold record, they always know, right? People don't know when they're building some cultural phenomenon. And I say that like very gently, but I don't think people know when it's happening necessarily. We sure didn't know it was happening.
It's one of those things that I don't think of course we wanted to be a hit, but it all came together at just the right notes, I guess.
Again, like NBA Street 2 is almost this perfect storm of vision, tone, and mechanics that all married together to create this experience that was kind of this is a one-time deal.
I think, one, the game really brought to life basketball culture. Yeah, it had NBA players, but it also had like these fictitious, unknown players, which is such a big part of basketball culture and street ball. It's like, how many guys have you seen that were incredible that never made the NBA?
It's authentic. Anytime you do anything authentic, it sticks. So you can make people care about something that they ordinarily wouldn't care about as long as it's authentic.
I didn't expect so many people to just be like, no, this is just a good game, period. Like a lot of people who were like me and were not necessarily NBA people or basketball people really came out of the woodwork and were like, oh yeah, no, I own one sports game and it's NBA Street Volume 2.
Sometimes people wouldn't know me or they wouldn't recognize me right away. But as soon as I open up my mouth, somebody would be like, yo, Bobbito for NBA Street. Yo, that's great.
There was so many factors that all were happening at the same time. You can't point your finger at one thing and say this is why NBA Street was so great. It was a moment in time.
Several years later, down at E3, somebody had come up to me and said, all these games are great. What I really want to know is, when are you all doing another NBA Street? Because NBA Street, right? NBA Street influenced my life. That's when I was kind of like, oh, wow. Okay, that game was real special.
I think the Mount Rushmore of basketball video games goes something like this. NBA Jam, a game that undoubtedly influenced Street 2's style. NBA Live 96, the game that kicked off the first real dominant era of a simulation franchise. NBA 2K11, which has arguably one of the most fun game modes of any NBA title ever with the Jordan Challenge. And for my money, NBA Street Volume 2. Still, a big, glaring, obvious question looms over the legacy of the game. If the public is still interested, where the hell is NBA Street Volume 4?
There's never a long period of time that goes by before something pops back up on social media like, can we get another NBA Street 2? Can we get a remaster? All I will say is that some interesting conversations have come about because of that.
I think it would be, it would have to be different though. You can't try to, like Volume 2B. Again, like what's its authentic soul now? That would be the interesting question to ask.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know of nothing, as a fan of the franchise. I hope so. That'd be super cool. But as we know, timing is everything. But I would look forward to playing it.
There's always people like, yo, they should re-release the game, and put you back in it. I'm like, I'll be down, I'll do it again.
For a game that continues to evolve all these years later, surely there's more to explore. Surely there's enough inspiration to fire up the machine yet again and expose true hoops culture to a new generation.
It's forever changed me, just seeing that stuff, the first time in New York.
When we went to these basketball courts, like the way me and Adam would describe it, these are like churches. And it's completely different than how it was, particularly at the time, displayed in the media. Like this was like family, community, like it was like going to church.
Personally, I love this comparison. There is something almost religious about the way a raucous game at the park goes down, and this game depicted that. The congregation is on their feet, the band is getting into their groove, the reverend is at the pulpit, making sure that the energy level in the building stays high, and every once in a while, the spirit moves and the people are so overwhelmed with joy that they can't stay in their seats. All these years later, that joy can still be felt, and that's enough to make a man reminisce. Let me know if you agree.